Yeah, so let me just start then. So I'm sorry. So I want to argue for a distinction between fictional and intentional objects. So my general approach is one where one pays a lot of attention to natural language, and the point of departure is to uncover the project is to uncover the ontology that is implicit in natural language, or the ontology of natural language. Now, a common view when in the discussion of fictional objects is that fictional objects are just non-existent objects. And I think that is wrong. So I would like to argue for a sharp distinction between fictional objects, which are part of literary works or something like that, and what I call intentional objects. So in fact, fictional objects as parts of literary works cannot really be viewed as non-existent objects, because literary works are generally taken to be existent objects or artifacts. And now, if fictional objects are just parts of artifacts, then they should be as existent as the artifacts themselves. And fictional objects also, I think, in the way we talk about them in natural language, are things that exist. But natural language also reflects non-existent objects, clearly. And these are what I call intentional objects. And so the difference between fictional objects and intentional objects, on my view, is the way they depend on referential acts. So acts of referring or trying to refer or pretending to refer, and then associated acts of attributing properties. So fictional objects are ontologically dependent on referential acts, but also on an intention to create a piece of fiction. And that is crucial. So like the entire piece of fiction depends on an intention to create it, a fictional object that is part of the literary work is ontologically dependent on that intention. And now intentional objects, which have the status as non-existence, depend also on referential acts, but they only depend on the acts of attributing properties within the fiction, and the acts of attempting or pretending to refer. And so I take fictional and intentional objects to crucially depend on these referential acts. So not every philosopher has that view of, in particular, non-existent objects. So there's an alternative view on which non-existent objects are merely possible objects, or maybe individuated in terms of property combinations. So this is a formal kind of view that I do not adopt. So why don't I adopt it? Because it's not what is reflected in the semantics of natural language. Intentional objects, or just individuated in terms of possible combinations of properties, should be available semantically, even in the absence of any kind of reference to referential acts in the sentence or in a preceding discourse. But in fact, intentional objects, so these things that have the status of non-existence, they require the presence of quasi-referential acts in the semantic structure of the sentence. And that I take to reflect their ontological dependence on those acts. So now I have the next page. So what kind of role do intentional and fictional objects play in semantics? Well, intentional objects are sort of the non-existent objects of imagining, conceiving, thinking about. But crucially, they do not come for free. So when we have a term for an object, it can't just happen that term latches onto an intentional object, so a non-existent object. But rather, when we make reference to something that one could truly say doesn't exist, then that requires the presence of mental or linguistic acts in the semantics of the semantic structure, in the semantics of the sentence. So in the semantic structure of the sentence, or perhaps the kind of preceding discourse. And yeah, so that is what I take to reflect the ontological dependence on such acts. And now I already mentioned there are two kinds of ontological dependence. So fictional objects depend on such acts, but also on an intention to produce a fiction. And entities that are just intentional objects that can be said to not exist, they do not depend on such an intention, but rather they just depend on these quasi-referential acts or referential acts that are pretend acts of reference or unsuccessful acts of reference with associated property attributions. And they are not intended to be produced, but rather they are non-intentionally generated by such acts. And that is also a form of ontological dependence, like the singleton set of Socrates that's sort of generated on the basis of Socrates, but yeah, so it depends on Socrates, but it's like generated. It's in that sense ontologically dependent. Now we can see the difference between fictional and intentional objects in the applicability of the predicate exists. So we refer to a fictional character, obviously, with the explicit term, with the term that explicitly refers to a fictional character, like the fictional character Anna Karenina. And intuitively, it seems to be true that the fictional character Anna Karenina exists because there's this fiction, the novel Anna Karenina, and it has that fictional character as its part. So intuitively, that sentence is true. Whereas when you say the fictional character, I don't know, Trump's dog or something exists, that is maybe false because there's no piece of fiction in which this kind of figure occurs. But one can also say something like 1b, the woman described in the novel Anna Karenina, and then one would rather say does not exist. So that seems to be true. So the woman described in that novel doesn't exist. And in fact, that's what you also have when you say too, Anna Karenina doesn't exist. So Anna Karenina exists seems to be false. So Anna Karenina doesn't exist seems to be true. So when we do not explicitly refer to a fictional character with this a positive construction, the fictional character Anna Karenina, then it seems we refer to something that has a status of not existing. And now what is interesting is that the very same piece of fiction, so the novel Anna Karenina, gives rise to the two sorts of objects, intentional objects, which have the status of non-existence, and fictional characters or fictional objects, which have the status of existence. Why is that possible? Well, first of all, it goes along, it seems, with two different kinds of terms. So a term explicitly referring to a fictional character is able to refer to the fictional character, as in 1a. And then other terms, like the simple proper name, that seems to prefer to just stand for the intentional object. Now, why is it possible that the same piece of fiction gives rise to these two kinds of objects? Well, because you can sort of select the acts of reference with the property attributions in the context of this fiction, and that generates the intentional object, and then you can add the intention to create that fiction, and a part of it that is this fictional character, and then you get, depending on that, the fictional character. So it's just what you select as the basis of this ontological dependence that gives you these two sorts of objects. Now, apart from this use of proper names like in two, why should we really posit intentional objects, so non-existence, as sort of part of the items that belong to, it seems, the ontology of natural language? Can't we just do without them and say deal with sentences where there's apparent reference to these entities in terms of by positing empty terms, let's say? Well, it seems that intentional objects are really needed for the compositional semantics of sentences with intentional verbs. That is, verbs like imagine, conceive, think about, refer to, mention, and intend. Now, if we just look at standard examples that are discussed in the philosophical literature, then we may not think that these sorts of entities are really needed for doing semantics. So let's look at such examples in 3a and 3b. So John imagined a castle or a round circle. Do these sentences really require positing a castle that is just a castle of imagination and so it doesn't exist? And then if you say, therefore, John imagined something, does something here really require quantifying over intentional objects? Well, here it is quite plausible that you do not really need intentional objects. So standard semantic views about intentional verbs, which one may take imagine to be, take the complement to just stand or provide an intentional quantifier or property as an argument of the predicate, so some higher order semantic value. So that was my analysis of intentional transitive verbs and that I proposed, and Montague proposed, and Edith Zimmermann proposed it. Properties are involved in the semantics of these verbs. So one might think that imagine is just one such verb, and it applies to a property or an intentional quantifier in sentences like 3a. Or maybe there's just a substitutional analysis that's available. So imagine, John imagine, and then indefinite NP is true just in case, so the complex predicate imagine and that NP holds of the subject referent. So what comes after the verb is just contributing to a complex predicate, and you just have the applicability conditions on the complex predicate, and that will give you the semantics. And then when you have something in place of the complement, then you would just have some form of substitutional analysis. Or if you take the complement to provide a higher order semantic value, like an intentional quantifier or a property, then something quantifies over this kind of higher order semantic value. So given standard views in both the philosophical and the semantic literature, one may very well think that in 3a and 3b, we do not need to posit entities that are non-existent objects for the semantics of those sentences. However, there are sentences that do require such objects. Otherwise, it seems impossible to do the compositional semantics of those sentences. And so here we just look at the need for doing compositional semantics, and it seems here we really need these sorts of entities. Like these are entities where you have a modifier of a noun phrase with an intentional verb, like imagine or refer to or think about. A modifier that it contains such a verb or maybe a corresponding adjective. And the entire noun phrase seems to stand for something that wouldn't exist. So an example is 4a, the castle John is imagining. And then you can continue, is small but nice. And then in the next sentence, you can use an anaphor and say, it is definitely not grand. And then you can continue, but unfortunately, it doesn't even exist. That's perfectly fine. And you can also, of course, say the castle John is imagining doesn't exist. Perfectly fine. So here, it seems the noun phrase in subject position is able to have a semantic value that is sort of something of which you can deny existence, and you can resume it with an anaphor. And it's possible to refer, it seems, to something like that because you are using this intentional verb imagining in the relative clause, like John is imagining is a relative clause modifying castle. With a view on which, like in say 3a, a castle just contributes part of a complex predicate. So, well, how do you get the semantic value of the castle John is imagining? Does this refer to an expression? Well, certainly not. It doesn't refer to a part of a complex predicate. It needs to refer to something that somehow corresponds to castle. So it doesn't refer to the entire predicate, imagining a castle. Well, you can't get the semantics of that noun phrase with a view on which imagine the castle is just a complex predicate. And also the castle John is imagining certainly doesn't refer to a property, because the property isn't said to be small and nice. And the property exists, even though the castle may not exist. So one doesn't refer to a property. One doesn't refer to an intentional quantifier, because it's not an intentional quantifier that's said to be small and nice. And an intentional quantifier exists whether or not the castle John is imagining exists. So clearly we do not have reference to a higher order semantic object, and we do not have reference to an expression. So we, it seems, need to have a kind of thing of which one can deny existence in order to do the compositional semantics of this kind of construction. And similarly in 4b, like the mathematical object that John imagined is impossible, and so on. And then you can resume that semantic value of the subject with a subsequent anaphor. And then in 5a and b, we can see that one can deny truly existence of what one seems to be referring to with those complex noun phrases in subject position. So this is one strong argument in favor of positing these intentional objects as entities for doing compositional semantics, and thus also as entities that are somehow part of the kind of ontology involved in natural language. Now, there's another argument in favor of these intentional objects, and it comes from negative existentials, like the castle John is imagining doesn't exist, but now negative existentials involving just proper names, like Anna Karenina doesn't exist. Now, in the literature, there is a well-known alternative analysis of negative existentials that doesn't involve positing a non-existent object as the semantic value of the subject, namely on which the subject would just be an empty term and not would have wide scope over the subject. So the King of France doesn't exist would have an analysis like it's not the case that the King of France exists because there's no King of France. So not, it would basically be metalinguistic negation that sort of denies the presupposition of the definite description. So that's Salmon's analysis. of negative existentials of the sort in 6, and it could also be carried over to negative existentials of the sort in 1 on the first page of the handout, like Anna Karenina, that doesn't exist. So one treats not as taking scope over the subject, so external negation, and having basically the effect of metalinguistic negation, negating a presupposition for the use of the subject. So why wouldn't that analysis work? Well, it's linguistically extremely implausible. So, but you can use metalinguistic negation and say, like the King of France is not bald because the King of France doesn't exist. Now, when you use metalinguistic negation, you focus not. So the King of France is not bald because the King of France doesn't exist. You wouldn't say the King of France is not bald, but he's so-and-so. If you don't focus it, then it doesn't seem to be, the sense doesn't seem to be felicitous. You convey the presupposition that there's a King of France. But if you use a negative existential, like in 6, a King of France doesn't exist, you don't need to focus not. You can focus exist. No problem. So not doesn't have the feeling of metalinguistic negation. And then there are other reasons not to adopt this analysis of not in negative existentials. So for example, with quantificational subjects like in 8, it's extremely implausible that we have external negation here. Everyone we talked about doesn't exist. So here one has to strongly focus not, but then actually you don't want to have not taking scope over everyone, but you want to just sort of deny existence of what you're talking about. And so this doesn't work very well for that example. And then external negation would be completely inapplicable to the kind of negation conveyed by exception sentences. So everyone we talked about except Anna Karenina exists. So here you convey the content of a negative existential, namely Anna Karenina doesn't exist, but you don't do it using not. So the analysis is quite simply not applicable to 9. So there doesn't seem to be a plausible alternative analysis of negative existentials, even with just proper names or definite descriptions, that is available. So the analysis on which those sentences involve some sort of reference to an intentional object, something that has the status of something non-existent, is much more plausible, just linguistically. Now, the observation is that intentional objects, so non-existent objects, do not come for free. So once we admit these non-existent intentional objects as semantic values, that doesn't mean now we can have them just anywhere and we basically lose the point of doing semantics, because now we are at a level of merely conceived non-existent objects, and we can no longer like get a notion of truth or so. That is not at all the case. So intentional objects as semantic values are highly restricted. They depend on the description of a quasi-referential act in the sentence, or at least an implicit reference to such an act. So not every non-referring description sort of generates an intentional object. And here I differ from the two views that I mentioned at the beginning, on which non-existent objects are merely possible objects or are generated by just some combination of properties. That's a view that I do not hold, because it's in fact not what natural language reflects. And then, of course, one also should make sense of that view by first, after having made the generalization on the basis of natural language, data. Yeah, so how do we see that? Well, compare the examples in 10a and 10b and 11a and 11b and so on. So if you just say the church in the village doesn't exist, that doesn't seem to be very good. So just saying this out of the blue, well, why should it even exist? Nobody was talking about such a church or made any claim about a church. So it doesn't see, this kind of sentence is not appropriate when no one had mentioned a church in the village. But when you say the church mentioned in the guide doesn't exist, that's perfectly fine. So here you have a description that sort of generates this kind of intentional object of which existence can be denied. But the mere description, the church in the village, doesn't generate it. And you have the same phenomenon with existential quantification in their sentences. So there's a house, so like their sentences involve quantification, but it's known that they can quantify over things of which one can deny existence, so that you can find in the Meinongian literature, Priest and others. Yeah, so no one can not really say there's a house that doesn't exist. So this sounds very peculiar. But it's perfectly fine to say something like 11b. There's a house John described that doesn't exist. That is perfectly fine. And we use such sentences all the time, even without being a pronounced Meinongian or so. So there's no philosophical view required in order to use such sentences. No explicit or reflective philosophical view, let's say. And similarly, so one can say 12a, Mary talked to, one can't really say 12a, Mary talked to a man that doesn't exist, that doesn't make any sense at all. But Mary described a man that doesn't exist, that's perfectly fine. Why is there this difference? Well, because talk to doesn't involve an object that would depend on that would be generated by an intentional, by a referential act. But describe takes an object that can be generated by a referential act. So one can describe something even if that something doesn't exist. And in that case, the description generates that object. So with modifiers like relative clauses containing an intentional verb like mention, describe, talk to, mention and describe, we can form noun phrases that can, it seems, take semantic values that have the status of entities that do not exist, so intentional objects. We can have the same kind of effect with adjectives. So we can say 13a and 13b. So the imagined or imaginary church doesn't exist. That's also fine. Or the mentioned building doesn't exist. But in any case, you need an intentional modifier in order to form a noun phrase that is able to stand for something of which the existence can be truly denied. Now, there's a linguistic question that arises. How is it possible that, like, the church mentioned in the guide doesn't exist refers to a church that fails to exist? So when you say the church doesn't exist, that's not good, but the church mentioned in the guide doesn't exist. Doesn't, like, the compositional semantics of 10b involve like intersecting the denotation of church with the denotation of mentioned in the guide, and that should give you a set of actual churches that are mentioned and of which you then should not be able to deny existence. Well, here one can make recourse to a particular syntactic view that has been defended by quite a number of syntacticians, including Chomsky at some point, and then more recently, for example, Cinque. So it's a view according to which relative clauses are formed in such a way that, like the head noun of the relative clause construction, in this case in 10b, the noun church originates from inside the relative clause. So, or let's say the castle John is imagining, that's the example I have in 27a. So here, castle, the head noun of the construction of this analysis, originates from inside the relative clause, so as a complement of imagining. Imagine is, of course, an intentional verb, which describes events that can generate intentional objects. So the noun originates from inside the relative clause as a complement of the intentional verb imagine. And then it moves up to the higher position. But that would be like at a later stage syntactically, so to speak, using like older syntactic terminology. It's not really so relevant in this context. Now, the point is, you don't need to interpret the second syntactic structure on which castle has been moved to the higher position, which gives you that problem. So if you interpret that structure, you should intersect the extension of castle with the extension of the property of things John is imagining, and then you should end up with actual castles. No, you can interpret only, you may interpret only the original syntactic structure in which castle is in the lower position. And then you will be able to get merely intentional objects, which are generated by acts of imagination, as the denotation of like John is imagining castle. So with this syntactic analysis of relative clauses, you get the right kind of semantics for sentences like 10b, 11b, and 12b. So you end up with a description of an intentional object of which existence can then be denied. Now, we also have, of course, sentences where we do not use an intentional verb, like negative existentials. The Golden Mountain doesn't exist, or Pegasus doesn't exist. So what happens in that case? So we had seen very strong arguments that here we do not have just an empty subject and external negation, but rather we have the same kind of phenomenon of a noun phrase standing for an entity that has a status of non-existence. But here we do not have explicit reference to an intentional act, as with imagine and think about and so on. So what is happening here, one can say, is there is implicit reference to like a historical chain of unsuccessful or quasi-referential, unsuccessful or pretend referential acts. So the Golden Mountain is interpreted with respect to such a chain. So maybe originally a link in the chain was an unsuccessful referential act, and then you take on that act and continue. You engage in that chain, even if you would just resume an act of pretend reference and so. But in any case, it is very plausible that the Golden, as a well-known description with a history, is connected with a historical chain of quasi-referential acts. And similarly for Pegasus, a well-known fictional name. So it is then that implicit reference to a chain of pretend acts that allows sort of generating an intentional object that of which one can deny existence. And now when one has a description where there isn't really implicit reference to such an act or chain of acts, then in fact it seems negative existentials are not felicitous. So like the blue apples in this room do not exist. that doesn't seem to make any sense unless somebody was talking about, like, imagine that there are blue apples in this room. And then one can respond, no, the blue apples in this room do not exist, and so on. But just out of the blue, it doesn't make any sense to say the blue apples in this room do not exist. So we really see, we really hear, let's say, that there is that only reference to, implicit reference to pretend acts of reference make negative existentials felicitous. So we have the same constraint at stake. And also, like, when you just make up a proper name and you know it doesn't stand for anything, let's say Mumu, it doesn't seem to be right to say Mumu doesn't exist unless you pretended to use it as if you were referring to someone. But out of the blue, just to say Mumu doesn't exist, and like everybody knows that Mumu isn't standing for anything, that doesn't seem to be appropriate. So this is a further argument against this view on which the subject of negative existentials is just an empty term. So it seems then that intentional objects are well reflected in natural language, but in a constrained way, namely they are available only in contexts in which there's explicit or implicit reference to quasi-referential acts. And so one can say they are really strictly generated by those quasi-referential acts, that is, unsuccessful or pretend referential mental or linguistic acts, or maybe states. So I take intentional objects to be ontologically dependent on those acts, and in fact, in a sense that they're automatically generated by them without there being an intention of, like, creating them as objects or as parts of a fiction or something, or as an artifact. And unlike fictional characters in that respect, so fictional characters, by contrast, are created through an intention of, like, being meant as intended artifacts. So this ontological dependence on acts is not like a causal relation. It's really a generative relation in the way I already explained. So it's really automatically when you do a pretend or unsuccessful referential act, you automatically generate an intentional object. That is the view. Now, there's a further piece of evidence for this dependence on a quasi-referential act, and that is that implicit arguments in the semantics of natural language cannot be non-existence. So, for example, Davidson had the view that verbs involve events as implicit arguments, but clearly we cannot use, so for Davidson, events are implicit arguments of verbs, but clearly we cannot use verbs describing merely intentional but non-existent events. So we can't say, like, John did not walk, meaning, well, John didn't participate in the merely planned walk that didn't actually take place or something like that. So it can't convey that there's a particular planned walk which John failed to do. That's not the kind of interpretation we can have. And similarly, like if you say it didn't rain, you can't refer to a non-existent location and say it didn't rain at that location, but rather when there's implicit arguments can only be actual objects or meant to be actual objects, let's say. And that simply follows from this view because implicit arguments don't allow for any space for reference to a quasi-referential act. So when you have an explicit noun phrase, then that noun phrase can be connected to like a historical chain of quasi-referential acts, and that allows it to refer to an intentional object. But that is not possible for a merely implicit argument, because there's nothing around that could connect with such intentional acts. So implicit arguments could be non-existent objects only if they have been introduced previously with an explicit noun phrase as such, like in 17. And again, that is just predicted. So now I want to say that intentional objects are not just dependent on like a particular quasi-referential act, but they depend on like a set of coordinated referential acts. So that is important for anaphora and so. So when one pretends to refer to an object or unsuccessfully refers to an object, then one can perform further acts, meaning to latch onto that same object, and those further acts would be coordinated with that first act. And it seems this coordination relation is important for the individuation of intentional objects. And it can basically be understood as a notion of coordination, except it now applies to acts rather than just occurrences of noun phrases. So we can have the notion of this notion of coordination as in 20. So intentional objects would then depend on coordinated referential, quasi-referential acts. Now the question is, well, how are intentional objects exactly introduced on the basis of coordinated quasi-referential acts? Now, semantically, one will say that noun phrases may have to be relativized for their semantics on to such a chain of quasi-referential acts. So take a proper name like Pegasus. Like Pegasus doesn't exist. A name need not just have an interpretation with respect to the standard parameters, but it may have an interpretation relative to a chain of coordinated quasi-referential acts. Or one may also just say coordinated acts that may be quasi-referential or referential to get a very general semantics of proper names. So, and then we get the semantics in 21. So we have a proper name, it's relativized to a chain of coordinated referential uses of that proper name. And so that name stands for an object D, just in case the acts that belong to that chain either refer to D, so in that case, D is an actual object, or now if these acts are quasi-referential acts, so they are unsuccessful or merely pretend acts, then they generate D as an intentional object. So D will come out as something that has the sorts of properties attributed through these acts in E, but it comes out as a non-existent object. And then similarly, for a definite description, we can get the same sort of semantics. So the N is relativized to a chain of coordinated referential uses of that definite description. And that definite description will stand for an object D, just in case D is the only element in the contextually relevant extension of the noun, or this chain of quasi-referential acts, or E consists in a chain of quasi-referential acts, and they generate D as an intentional object. So here you have a kind of disjunctive account of the semantics of proper names and definite descriptions, which accounts for both reference to an actual object and this kind of reference to an intentional object, and that on the basis of this implicit reference to a chain of referential uses of the name of or the definite description. Now we can come to the ontology. So we may say intentional states or acts consist of particular acts of attributing a property P in an act of referring R to, they consist in an act of attributing a property P to what the referential act R is meant to refer to. And then we will distinguish having a property from holding a property. So intentional object kind of holds the properties that the properties that are nuclear properties in Parsons' sense, and it has the properties that are extranuclear properties. So that distinction will also be important for this kind of account. And then we can say that an intentional object is obtained or generated in the way of 23. So we have an intentional state or act E, which involves these property attributions to what these referential acts that are part of E are meant to refer to. And then D is an intentional object generated by this state or act. If D depends for its existence on quasi-referential acts R that are part of E, and D holds a property P just in case, well, there's a property attribution that is part of this intentional act or state in the way I just described it. And so for all the property attributions that are coordinated with that first one. And now we can give conditions on different kinds of predicates. So we need to distinguish imagine, which takes as its arguments for the object position merely intentional objects, or can take such objects. And as opposed to talk to, which can only take actual objects. So we need to distinguish the ordinary domain of objects from like for each intentional act or state, we will get a domain of intentional objects generated by that act or state in the way that I just described. And so then we can say an existence entailing predicate has as its extension a subset of the ordinary domain, and a non-existence entailing one, like imagine or refer to or mention with respect to the object position, they have as their they have an object position that in part can get its arguments from a domain of intentional objects generated by the relevant intentional act or state, and that may precisely be the Davidsonian event argument of that predicate. So imagine, for example, we then have 24. So there's, for an event E, which is a Davidsonian event argument, and then entities D, so D is like the subject referent, the subject of the imagination, and then D prime is the object of imagination. And now D prime can, of course, be an actual object, like I imagine my sister or something, but it can also be a merely intentional object. So in the first case, D comes from the ordinary domain. In the second case, D comes from the domain that's generated by E. So it's the Davidsonian event argument of imagine that generates the part of the domain from which the object argument position gets its entities, its arguments. And on the basis of that, one can then also have the exact semantics of like the castle John is imagining. So imagine applies to merely intentional objects generated by this act of imagination, and one of them can be the semantic value of that complex noun phrase, the castle John is imagining. And then we can account for the semantics of the special predicate exists. Now here we need to distinguish a negative and a positive extension. So exist will also be relativized to an intentional act or chain of, a referential act or chain of referential or quasi-referential acts. Now, for something to be in the positive extension of exist, it needs to be in the ordinary domain. So it needs to be an actual object. And now we look at the negative extension, so something of which one can attribute non-existence. Such an entity needs to be in the domain generated by the chain of coordinated quasi-referential acts to which the interpretation of exists has been relativized. So like when you say Pegasus doesn't exist, here also the predicate exists is interpreted by relativizing to a historical chain of quasi-referential acts, and that historical chain generates entities that will be in the negative extension of exist. And then when you have like Pegasus doesn't exist, so you relativized Pegasus already to a particular chain of coordinated quasi-referential acts, then the negative extension of exist is relativized to that same chain. And then the semantic value of Pegasus, so that intentional object, needs to be in the domain of entities generated by that chain of quasi-referential acts. So because that this domain makes up the negative extension of exist with respect to that chain of quasi-referential acts. Yeah, so this is kind of the ontology and semantics of intentional objects. Now, fictional objects differ from intentional objects in that they are not just automatically generated by a set of coordinated quasi-referential acts, but rather they in addition require attention. And the intention, of course, is also on which the entire piece of fiction of which a fictional character is part depends on. So I find it actually entirely natural that fictional characters should exist because they're parts of things that are clearly generally recognized as existing artifacts, namely pieces of fiction. And pieces of fiction depend on an intention and the creation that goes along with it. And so the fictional characters depend on that as well. Yeah, then finally, one may compare intentional objects to the kinds of objects that are involved in fact, what is described by intentional transitive verbs. So far, I actually talked about transitive verbs that are intentional verbs, like imagine, think about, mention, refer to, describe. These are intentional verbs with a T, which take intentional objects as their arguments for the object position. They can also take actual objects, but they do take intentional objects as their arguments. And these verbs need to be distinguished from intentional transitive verbs like look for, search, need, and so on. So intentional transitive with an S. Why should there be this difference? Well, we can see the difference semantically. So when we have the verb look for or want, then like a search can be satisfied by an object. So a search, look for takes a complement. John is looking for a castle, and the sentence can be true without there being an existing castle that is needed for the truth of the sentence. But the castle need not actually be an intentional object. And in fact, the castle that can satisfy, well, so John is looking for a castle. What role do castles play in the semantics of that sentence? The role they actually play is as actual castles. So the semantics of that sentence, John is looking for a castle, involves like situations of satisfaction of the search in which there is an actual castle. And so, or let's say John is looking for a house. So John's search is satisfied if there's a suitable house that John now has. And then one can in fact say, this is a house John was looking for, where we have an identity of an actual house with a house that satisfies John's search. So this kind of identity is possible. But now this is not possible with the imagination. So John imagined a house of a particular sort. And so here it seems wrong to say, this is a house John imagined. So a merely intentional object cannot turn out to be identical to an actual object. But the kind of object that satisfies a search can turn out to be identical to an actual object. So this is an important difference between intentional transitive verbs and intentional verbs. that are transitive. But still, there are important connections as well between like imagination and searches or desires. So one can say John imagined a castle, John wanted a castle. So John wants what he imagined, or John imagined what he wants. So there are, of course, connections between the two sorts of mental states that these two types can describe. Okay, good. I think I conclude with that.
Okay, thank you so much, Friederike. So, any questions? Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I would like to ask a more general question about the methodology and maybe methodology of this natural language ontology analysis. So maybe there are some sort of Freudian abstraction principles play a central role. Do you think that existence follow trivially from the semantics? And when you draw a distinction between core and periphery, and you say that maybe in natural language we do not referring to intentional objects in the core. What's the criteria to think that it's not in the core? Like, what's the methodology and methodology of this?
Good, yeah. So I did make this peripheral distinction in my more foundational work on natural language ontology. Now, the core peripheral distinction was motivated by like setting apart philosophical uses of I don't know, the nothing, or the the existence of everything there is. Like you can use a noun existence as a sort of attribute that applies to everything there is, including events and so. So the view is that the noun existence belongs to the periphery, whereas the verb to exist belongs to a core. Why? Because there are constraints that no philosophical reflection or non-ordinary but legitimate use of language can avoid. So one can't possibly say the rain still exists, or the murder of the two Jews existed yesterday. Completely impossible. And it's completely impossible also for a philosopher that firmly believes in the univocality of existence. So this is the motivation for this core peripheral distinction. Now, I would actually think that the verb exists always belongs to the core, even though it's sort of seems to be imported relatively late, I think, into English from Latin, but that doesn't really matter. It seems to latch on to core ontology, let's say, in for example, the distinction between endurance and perdurance. And I would also say intentional objects belong to the core. So like everybody, without any philosophical reflection, can say the building described in the guide doesn't exist. Whereas I would say the use of language in the periphery requires some form of philosophical reflection. And in fact, and that goes along with certain constraints. So I actually think that verbs can never be used in the periphery. Nouns can always be used in the periphery, but then like constructions like the castle John described, constructional meaning is also always part of the core. It's not part of the periphery. So you cannot. But let's say you are a philosopher who absolutely rejects intentional objects. He would still say the building described in the guide doesn't exist. I don't think he would refuse such a sentence because of his or her convictions. Yeah, so I believe that constructional meaning, which goes along with intentional objects, is part of the core, and thereby intentional objects are part of the core.
Okay, thank you. And one clarification question on page 9. You give an example with musical work. Compare the singleton set containing a musical work, the non-intended product generated by acts of musical composition. I don't understand why it's non-intended product. Page 9, two kinds of ontological dependence.
Yeah, so like a musical work requires intention. So a musical composition is ontologically dependent on an intention to create that work and the acts of creating it. But now the musical composition also generates a singleton set containing it. And that singleton set doesn't depend on the intention anymore. So that's, I think that's what I meant to say. So so if you have unsuccessful acts, so I think there's like a cat standing in front of the window or something. So the cat standing in front of my window seems to be gray. No, it turned out there's no cat, but like I unsuccessfully referred to a cat. Now this unsuccessful act automatically generates an intentional object. I don't need to have. I'm not a poet or I'm not being creative, pretending to trying to refer to this cat. So so whenever I mean to refer to something, there's an intentional object automatically generated on the basis of that act. So that's the view. But if I'm a writer, a poet who means to compose a piece of fiction with various characters in it, then what I produce depends on an intention. So I'm not being poetical by just referring to a cat that I think I see outside of my window.
Just curious, by any chance, is this example comes from Kit Fine's example of singleton of Socrates and Socrates, or not?
Yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, but I don't mean it to argue for the direction of ontological dependence. So, yeah, Fine used it in order to argue that, like, the singleton necessarily contains Socrates, but it doesn't ontologically depend on. The Socrates doesn't ontologically depend on the singleton, though, necessarily it implies the existence of the singleton set. But yeah, so I mean, I use the example because it rings a little bit of a bell already, but yeah, it's just a very simple way of generating objects through ontological dependence without there being any kind of causation involved or intention or so. Yeah.
I'm interested in philosophy of music, and maybe you have some ideas how to analyze our talk regarding music. Maybe our talk is platonistic, and do you maybe you wrote something about that elsewhere?
So how that relates to the philosophy of music?
How we analyze our talk regarding musical works, musical objects.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have special views on that. I just take them to be creations that require an intention, and we refer to lots of created objects that I find this completely yeah, natural. And I wouldn't share that view on which I think there's a view on which musical works are sort of uncovered rather than created. So it's not the view that I would share without now having a very original defense on that view. I just see like in the case of intentional objects, I see that dependence on acts really being reflected in natural language.
And a last one, more general, does the natural language ontology analysis require any sort of meta-ontology?
Any sort of?
Meta-ontology.
Meta-ontology.
Yes, meta-ontological use. Does it mean it at all?
Yeah, so I sort of adopt that view that Kit Fine put forward, that so first we look at data. So Kit Fine called the ordinary judgments. So for me, these are mainly like linguistically reflected intuitions, let's say, or linguistic data, if you like. But you can really say linguistic data serve to uncover ontologically relevant intuitions. And I think the notion of an intuition is sort of something that can really make use of. So, and then we want to give an ontology of those data, ordinary judgments, intuitions, linguistically reflected or otherwise, and that ontology is sort of the shallow ontology, to use a term that Kit Fine once used. So it's the ontology of naive metaphysics, or the ontology of natural language. So that's the first level. And then one can ask, well, can we explain the items in that ontology in more fundamental terms? So we have these intentional objects. Can we explain them in more fundamental terms, and also the other things that we find in that ontology? But that's another step, and one shouldn't skip the first step. So this is something Kit Fine defended, something I totally adopt. And in fact, I'm mainly interested in that first level rather than in foundational questions of how to ultimately reduce that first level to other things. So one can very well be engaged in just identifying that first level of ontology that's reflected or not, and without being particularly interested in the second question of explaining that ontology in or reducing it in other terms to more fundamental entities or something like that.
Is it what he called naive metaphysics or something like that?
Exactly. So that first level is naive. Actually, basically does naive metaphysics in truth-maker semantics, issues of ontological dependence, and so on. It's all at the level of naive metaphysics. Yeah.
Okay, thank you really much for your answers and your wonderful presentation and paper and your work and contribution.
Okay, then Alberto, please, your question.
Can you see and hear me?
I hear you. Yes, I don't see you, but I hear you.
Hi, Friederike. I try to also unmute my video, but for some reason it doesn't work. Thanks a lot for your talk. I would have a lot of questions, actually. I just squeeze into the main three. First, your distinction between the cases, say, the church in the village does not exist, which is weird, unlike the church John imagined that does not exist, can be mapped also to the case of sentences involving or being about possible entities. For it seems that it works exactly in the same way. For instance, if you say the son of Philip II of Spain and Elizabeth I of England does not exist, this is weird. But if you say the possible son of Philip II and Elizabeth I, this seems does not exist, this seems perfectly okay. Second question, maybe I can list them. If we, I agree with your distinction between intentional and fictional entities, but since for you intentional entities are intentional objects are somehow dependent on sort of intentional acts, how do you square with cases of so-called intentional identity a la Geach, in which it seems that you cannot rely on the same referential chain because the thinkers are not related by the same chain, as in the case Hobbes believes that a witch blighted Bob's mare, and Nobbs believes that she killed Cobb's sow. And the third question concerns existence for fictional characters or objects. I agree with you that there is a sense according to which Anna Karenina exists is true, but there is also another sense according to which Anna Karenina does not exist is true as well. Because if you say, if you, for instance, consider comparative existential statements, such as Anna Karenina exists just like Lady Gaga and Angela Merkel, it seems that here people would deny that this is the case, because people would react by saying, well, if Anna Karenina exists, she exists in her own way, which is different from the way in which Lady Gaga and Angela Merkel exist. Okay, these are my, I hope they were understandable.
Good, yeah. Very good. So the addition of the modifier possible, does enable reference to merely possible objects. Well, one might say maybe possible here is like epistemic possibility, and so you set up an epistemic, epistemically possible object, which already has a sort of a status of an intentional object. But one may even say like the metaphysically possible object, ruling like that particular reading out. So, but then I would say, well, this is a special case. So we can make reference to merely possible objects if like there's a predicate that introduces that particular domain of merely possible objects, but it doesn't come for free. Yeah, so that's what I would say. So you can introduce the domain of merely possible objects, and then deny existence of them. Well, maybe then there's a shift. Well, actually, maybe these merely possible objects, they count as intentional objects as well, and there's something going on with those domains that I talk about later. Yeah, something like this, I would say. Now, with the coordination, so these Hobbes cases, they should be covered by this notion of coordination. So not all acts need to be coordinated, but like with the Hobbes sense, a common source can ensure coordination among some acts. So if the two agents have like nothing in common, then it doesn't seem to be possible to use these anaphora. So there need to be at least a common source or so. And so the coordination may come from the outside rather than the intention of those agents. So I would extend the notion of coordination in a suitable way. And then the Anna Karenina case, so I would say when you say you accept Anna Karenina exists in this, then that's in the sense of like the fictional character. So there's a bit of a pause where you feel like there's implicit reference to this piece of fiction involved or like fictional character. And yeah, otherwise it would be true to say it does not exist. And yeah, so I wouldn't relativize the verb exists to different ways of being, but rather I would just say it's how the subject is possibly relativized to a chain of coordinated pretend acts, or not just such a chain, but also an intention. And if you relativize it also to an intention, then you end up with a fictional character and not just an intentional object. So I would attribute the difference to what the name in its interpretation is relativized to. And I would say relativizing it to an intention requires a bit more work. That's why the interpretation Anna Karenina exists, or when it's true, is harder to get.
Okay, thank you so much. Just a reply as to my first question. The reason why I compared the cases with intentional objects in cases with metaphysically possible objects, that I was interested in, is that it seems that there is a similar issue of existence entailing and non-existence entailing in the relevant descriptions that make it the case that certain sentences are weird, whereas some other ones are not. Because when you say the church in the village does not exist, since being a church in a village is an existence entailing property, it seems that the reason why the sentence is weird is just that you are saying something like the thing that exists does not exist. Ditto for the case of the son of, say, Philip II and Elizabeth I. Whereas if you say things like the church John imagined, blah, 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 or the possible son, blah, 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 the relevant properties that you mobilize are not existence entailing properties. And this is why you can say in both cases, the church John imagined does not exist, and the possible son, blah, 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 does not exist as well.
Right, yeah. Even though one, with this existence entailingness, so John imagined a church. So why is a church not existence entailing? So just take it's a simple case. One needs to do a bit of work for that. So it's yeah. So a church here characterizes a merely intentional object, and that is somehow possible because of the relation between, I would say, this Davidsonian event argument and the object argument position, in that the event argument generates entities in the object argument position, and the complement can be used to be attributed to this intentional object, but not in the sense of having, but holding. So it's not entirely obvious how to account for that. So just appealing to the effect of possible or imaginary isn't yet enough. One has to really do some work of accounting for how you can use an existence entailing predicate with these sorts of modifiers or verbs.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, Carola, your question, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to ask just a minute, this is maybe a sort of follow-up. Do you see a continuum between purely intentional objects and purely fictional objects?
No, actually, at this point, it's a sharp distinction. Even though the same piece of fiction generates both. And that's because you can, if you have a piece of fiction, you can take the quasi-referential acts that are part of the creation of that fiction, but leave out the intention. Then you get what is generated is the intentional object. Or you can take the piece of fiction, take these quasi-referential acts and the intention to create that piece of fiction. Then what you get is the fictional character.
Yeah, but you can maybe also imagine some borderline cases where, I mean, you do not really want to create that piece of fiction. You have an intentional object, then it is somehow transformed in a fictional entity. And maybe in those cases, you would accept of having to do with both.
So it was first a merely intentional object, and then you turn it into a fictional object.
Yes, in the process of creation, imagine a writer in the process of creation. Maybe he first has just an intentional object in mind, and then this object is somehow transformed.
No, you can't have an intentional object in mind. That's actually not possible. So as soon as you have it in mind, you create something.
Mm.
So like if I refer to the cat in front of my window, which I thought there was, like it's just an intentional object. But now if I start a fantasy about it, so let's take this cat in front of my window, which I was just talking about, and so on. And then we may sort of start creating a piece of fiction, but I really change the basis for it.
Thank you.
So intentional objects are strictly generated. So whenever you seem to be referring to something, automatically an intentional object is generated. But you can't intend to generate an intentional object. That's not possible. If you intend to refer to generate some kind of object, you can only end up with a fictional character.
Thank you.
Okay, so any more questions? No? Okay, then, Friederike, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.